So as far as the syllabus is concerned, these are the things you need to be able to do. One, state that there's usually extensive genetic variation within a population of a species. But literally just look out of your window. We, as humans, are all the same species, and just look at the variation. It's especially visible in multicultural places like Bradford. We're all one species, yet we vary massively. In fact, we share more than 99.5% of our DNA structure with the next person that we see. That's why we're the same species. And that discovery has made it's made a very big impact on classification. Because as it turns out, you can look at some animals and plants and various organisms and classify them based on looks, which is what Carl Linnaeus did when he was inventing the modern classification system. But it turns out that some animals that we wouldn't have thought were related actually are. For example, a koala. Koalas are not bears. Their nearest relatives, in terms of placental mammals, are actually foxes, believe it or not. Not only that, but we share 80% approximately of our genetic makeup, as in gene mapping and so on, with bananas. Right, another thing we have to do, explain how evolution occurs through the natural selection of variants that have given rise to phenotypes best suited to the environment. So we're looking at the work of Mr. Charles Darwin. We're also describing what evolution actually is and how it leads to the formation of new species. And that's really to do with something called genetic drift. We're also going to look at evidence for evolution. And mentioning names, Darwin and Wallace, and how they pretty much, between them, laid the foundations for molecular biology and taxonomy, classification, evolutionary biology. A lot of modern biology really comes from those two guys. Now then, evidence. For evidence of evolution, you really need to be looking at sedimentary rocks, because sedimentary rocks are laid down in layers. The older the layer, the deeper it is, because sedimentary rocks are laid down basically by rivers. So rivers depositing silt. So if something dies and doesn't rot and then gets covered in more silt, eventually, if the conditions are right, it'll fossilize. So all the soluble bone molecules will dissolve out and be replaced by something else, by something insoluble, which is harder than any of the rocks around it. But it's important for fossilization that no microorganisms get in there, because they will cause decomposition. Decomposition means that fossilization won't happen because there's nothing to fossilize, except for, of course, in ash or mud, which will leave impressions. And there are fossilized footprints being found in various places around the world. The history of life on Earth, as shown by fossils, is called the fossil record. And yes, there are gaps, because there isn't the right kind of conditions everywhere on the planet at the right time to capture everything. It helps tell the evolutionary story of past and present organisms. It can show how the changes in an organism were linked to changes in its habitat, which is the basis of what Charles Darwin was talking about. The fossil record can show how different species evolved from common ancestors. So, for example, we did not evolve from monkeys. We evolved from the same common ancestor as the monkeys. So if you go back in time, 20, 30, 40 million years, there was an animal that evolved in several different ways. Some of its descendants became monkeys. Some of its descendants basically got bigger, lost their tails. It was an advantage not to have one, and became the great apes. Some out of those walked upright. That was an advantage. That got passed on. They had bigger brains. That was an advantage. That was passed on, and so on by variation. And that's how we came about. And the reason that we're here and other human species, such as Homo habilis, Homo neanderthalis, and so on, are because we adapted to changing conditions better than they did. That's especially true based on what we know of Homo neanderthalis. Homo neanderthalis, so named because their remains were originally discovered in the Neanderthal Valley in Germany. Now, they had a culture, they had belief systems, they buried bodies with grave goods. There is evidence to show that we, in our species, Homo sapiens, interbred with them. And that evidence is ginger hair, for instance. The genes for ginger hair are actually older than our entire species. So we interbred with them. So they were close enough genetically for that to happen and produce viable offspring. It's just that, according to various theories, we bred faster than they did. And because of our vocal cord structure, we could communicate better. And another one of the more out there theories is that it was our domestication of wolves and hunting dogs that gave us the advantage because we could hunt better. Now, all this was formally started by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, even though it is said that the English polymath Robert Hooke also made observations about how living things and how they change. But Jean-Baptiste Lamarck owned a museum in Paris, and going through the collections, he realized that some of these fossilized animals no longer existed, but they had similarities to some of the animal collections that were still around, specifically looking at insects. So there were long dead fossilized insects that were similar, but not the same, similar to modern day ones. Too similar for it to be a coincidence, but they were different, which kind of messed up the idea that everything that has been alive is still alive, and in terms of species, and nothing's, evolution doesn't happen, etc., etc. If that's true, how come there was no evidence of several modern day animals in the fossil record? And how come some of these animals in the fossil record didn't still exist today? Something's happened. Something's changed. Now, Lamarck's theory was based on under or overuse of body parts. So a giraffe got a long neck because of reaching up to the tops of trees. And by doing that every day, it became one of their characteristics, and they passed that on to their offspring. And then they were stretching up and they passed it on to their offspring, and so on. Problem with that was easily shown by one of Lamarck's contemporaries, because what he did was he got some mice, cut their tails off, and then let them breed. According to Lamarck's theory, that would mean that the offspring mice would also have no tail. Problem was, they did have tails. So that was his idea out the window. Charles Darwin suggested a slightly different approach to how it happened. What he suggested was that, for one thing, variation happened. So animals and plants varied. They were different. Even within a species, they had minor differences. And that some of those differences gave them an advantage. And those advantages helped them survive better and made them more attractive for mating. So those traits ended up being passed on to the next generation. Natural selection, you see. And to test these theories, he went to the Galapagos Islands. He rode on giant tortoises. He looked at finches. He looked at plants. He looked at the iguana, and all the flora and fauna that was there. He studied them, which kind of put the ship's biologist's nose out of joint, because Darwin had joined the crew as the ship's geologist. He was supposed to be looking at rocks, not at animals and plants. So the actual biologist wasn't right happy about that. But Darwin was from a rich family and funded the expedition, at least partially, so it was a case of put up or shut up. Now, so linking Darwin's theory to the whole thing about long giraffes' necks goes as follows. Natural variations mean that out of the population of giraffes, their necks will be all different lengths. The ones with the longer necks can reach more food than the ones with shorter necks, but there will be ones with very long necks that maybe can't balance very well and end up being caught by predators. The long-necked giraffes, so the ones with the reasonably long necks, can still run away from predators and they can get to the better food. The ones with the shorter necks may be able to run even faster to get away from the predators, but they can't reach the really good food. Which means the ones in the middle with the longer necks can reach the food, they can run away from predators, they produce more healthy offspring. So those traits of longer necks and speed end up being passed on. So that ends up, since the short neck ones can't reach the trees, they starve. So that trait, the short neck giraffe with the fast legs, kind of, runs its course. they can't get mates because they don't have the energy and they starve to death and they don't mate. So those characteristics don't get passed on. Whereas the ones with the really long necks, they don't get to mate because although they can get to the top, really to the tops of the trees, they can't run fast enough to escape the predators. So the ones who can do both end up giving healthy offspring to future generations. That's all well, and I mean, that is just theoretical, but Darwin's work was based on practical observation. Now, the Galapagos Islands are quite a long way off the Americas, which means that they are kind of genetically isolated. So the finches that live on those islands couldn't get back to the mainland very often, if at all, to breed with the local populations there. And as you would expect, between the various different islands, which were also quite a distance apart, which cuts down on movement between them, they had different conditions. So some finches, like it says there, had strong claw-like beaks, really good for crunching seeds. So they survived best on islands where there were a lot of sort of nut-like seeds. Some finches had thin, delicate beaks that were good for digging insects out. So they survived best on islands where there was a lot of insect life down in the ground. Now, Darwin's idea was that they all had a common ancestor. And yeah, in terms of looks, there was certainly a finch back on the mainland that fitted the bill, to pardon the pun. They all look like variations on that type of mainland finch. Turns out that all these finches were actually different species, because what had happened is the ones with the big beaks on Island 1 had all survived back. So they'd all bred together. And each time you get that population breeding together, genetically, they drift away from the original. Various genes become part of the genome for that animal, and some get shoved out, like the long, thin beaks, for instance. Over time, there would be less and less of them with the thinner beaks. Eventually, that would lead to them becoming, the genetic drift will get to the point where it would top 0.5%. That's all it needs. And then you've got a new species. Whereas on the other islands, the different beak sizes and shapes, same thing happened. But as it says there, if the habitat changes, what was successful can become unsuccessful. For example, with those finches, what if, for example, the seeds that they were eating is on one island, there was a fire, all the trees that had those seeds were burned to the ground. Those animals, those birds would then struggle because that is their food source gone. A successful species can adapt. I mean, there's an example there of rabbits, but there is a brilliant example in nature, the Arctic fox. During the winter, the Arctic fox has white fur, thick white fur, which not only keeps it warm, but it also camouflages it. During the short summer months where they live, they lose that layer of white fur, and their fur during the summer is sort of a grey brown, which allows them to blend into the soil and rock of their natural habitat. Up in Scotland, there is a bird called a ptarmigan, similar thing. During the winter, they are white with little white speckles, with little black speckles. During the summer, during the breeding season, their feathers are jet black and they are very noisy. So they adapt to their environment. And probably the very best adaptive organisms, as it stands, is us. Because whereas over the time we've been a species, several species have become extinct. We haven't. We've dodged that bullet because we adapt faster. We can adapt to just about any environment on this planet. In fact, we've even got to the stage where we start adapting the environment to suit us. What do I mean by that? Look at the building you're in. We've adapted to be able to build our own habitats. That's how we adapt to the environment. We change it to fit us. So yeah, okay, famous example, the dodo. Large flightless bird, lived on Mauritius. Not scared of anything. Fear requires energy. Running away requires energy. Fighting requires energy. So if you're docile and placid, you're not using much energy, so you don't need to eat as much. And you can get big. And then because the dodo had no natural predators on the islands that it lived on, when rats, cats, humans were introduced and, well, it started eating them, they couldn't adapt fast enough to make a run for it. Because think about it like this, right? You've been on a ship for several months. You've been eating ship's biscuits and drinking that heavily diluted rum for months. You get onto an island and you can see fresh meat right there in front of you. And they don't even run away. It's roast dodo for tea. Also, unfortunately, one of their big problems was that they were slow at breeding. So what traits might have helped the dodo to survive longer? Fear. The ability to feel fear. Faster breeding cycle. That would have allowed them to survive because that would have also brought in more variation. Yeah, poor old Darwin. Well, he knew that his findings were going to be controversial and, yeah, blasphemous because the church was still very powerful then. Thing is, he was rich, so he was insulated from that. His wife also didn't approve of the theory of evolution, so he never actually published it until after she had died. In fact, it was near the end of his life when he actually published it. And this was several years after he'd lost contact with Alfred Russel Wallace, because during the early days when they were researching all these theories and doing the work on that, Wallace and Darwin worked together. And then, according to reports anyway, Wallace just kind of vanished for several years, probably, off on some kind of research voyage, but he didn't have the communications because he didn't have the money that Darwin had. So eventually, even though they had promised to publish together, Darwin published his book. Wallace came back a few years later and basically said, "Hey, you promised that we'd publish together." But yeah, Alfie, you vanished. Luckily for Darwin and Wallace eventually, there were several influential people who supported him, or else he'd never got published. And basically, the evidence for evolution having actually happened, well, it's overwhelming. Especially now we can look at techniques using DNA and genetics. Back in the Victorian era, they didn't know about genetics because a lot of it was because they'd laughed at Gregor Mendel. If his research had been available to Darwin and Wallace, that would have cracked everything wide open because they would have been able to use all this stuff about alleles, phenotypes, genotypes to explain how evolution happened and how variation happens. And also more information about fossilization and tectonic plates and so on would have also been. Now, the tectonic plates idea wasn't even accepted until, I think it was during the 60s, actually. During the 50s or 60s, when the whole idea of tectonic plate movements was finally accepted. Alfred Venegar, I think the guy's name was, who proposed it, and he was roundly laughed at. But yeah, back to the biology. These days, now, and this is only the last 40, 50 years, in fact, 20 or 30 actually, you can compare DNA. This is how we found out, for instance, that something north of 98% of human and chimpanzee genes are the same. They are pretty much our closest genetic relatives. In terms of how life started, there's several different, well, you could say competing theories, but when you look at them, you're probably going to end up thinking, actually, like I do, that it's probably all of them, a bit of everything. Because theory number one is the old primordial soup theory. So proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, all hanging about in a broth of molecules, and they just happen to, by sheer chance, arrange themselves into a cell. There might have been a bolt of lightning that made it happen, just to give it a bit more energy to do it, and there you go, biochemistry. And I do vaguely remember, I don't know whether it's true or not, it might be just something in some bit of old 70s science fiction that I saw, that somebody actually attempted this in a lab and actually managed to create cells, but then it was shut down rapidly, playing God. Like I said, I don't know whether that's true or not. There is the hydrothermal theory. Now, this is new stuff, because up until very recently, it was known that there was no life living around hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the sea. And then somebody managed to make a submarine, a robot submarine that was capable of going down there. And having a look and found it to be teeming with life. So metabolites formed in hot, high-pressure, low-oxygen environments, and they kind of all, and they could have well have drifted into the prebiotic broth, and then it all happened there. And then there's the comet theory, that all the things that make life possible, such as water, arrived on comets and meteorites crashing into the Earth, which does make a bit of sense because we do know what comets are made of. Comets are made of ice and various different organic and inorganic compounds. By organic, I mean like inorganic chemistry, carbon chains, things like that. So that could have contributed to the prebiotic broth. And if it landed somewhere near a hydrothermal vent, you put them all together and you've possibly got life. Now, evidence for evolution then. Quote from Darwin himself. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. So he never said survival of the fittest. That was Malthus, I think. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but rather the one most responsive to change. And the environment is changing even more rapidly now than it has been for the past few thousand years. Classic example, the peppered moth. This is a favourite for exams, mentioning the peppered moth. Up until something like 150 years ago, the white peppered moth with the black speckles was the most common form because it could hide on, basically it landed on trees and it blended in with all the lichens and so on. The dark peppered moths, which was created, the dark was created by a recessive gene, were a lot rarer because the birds that ate the peppered moths could easily spot them. Then, during the Industrial Revolution, and up until 20 or 30, no, about 30 or 40 years ago now, cities were polluted, very polluted. The Industrial Revolution, massive amounts of smoke, massive amounts of soot, coating buildings, everything got darker. So the darker ones, the melanated peppered moths, had a built-in advantage. They had camouflage, whereas the white ones didn't. So the population of the white ones had been declining for 150 years. Recessive gene became almost like the dominant one. Eventually, with the Clean Air Act and so on in the 70s, that started to clean up the environment. Less people using coal fires, less smoke, and so on. So lichens started to grow again on trees more often. The darkening of the buildings and so on, the darkening of the soot on the trees wasn't as much of a problem anymore. So the birds could now see the black ones again. So more recently, the populations of the white peppered moth have started to go back up again in comparison to the dark. Another big one, and this is in the last, 50, 60 years, antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Back in the 1950s, pretty much every single bacterial infection was susceptible to penicillin, which was the only antibiotic they had available. And then it was overprescribed. So everything got a dose of penicillin. So everything that was susceptible to penicillin had its population savaged. But because of variation, remember, a tiny proportion of those bacteria might have somehow been were immune to the penicillin. And since they didn't get competed out, they became the major part of the population, which means suddenly penicillin is no longer as effective. And that's still happening. MRSA is something that started to happen, what would it be, about 25 years ago, 25 to 30 years ago, something like that. Methicillin, more specific as an antibiotic. It's more powerful than one of the broad spectrum antibiotics like penicillin. And up until 25 years ago, approximately, it was one of the go-to antibiotics if the likes of the penicillins didn't work. And then because of overprescription and people not finishing the course of antibiotics, you start to get strains of bacteria, strains of Staphylococcus aureus, which is a standard normal flora on a lot of people. You started to see resistant strains of that, which is bad because that'll kill you. But it's a common microbe. You start using vancomycin. Unfortunately, we've now also got vancomycin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So evolution happens. There's your proof. And look, we've got a glossary.